So good to be in person for a little info session, right? We used to do these all the time. I'm so glad to see you guys. We've got Andy Blow here from Precision Fuel and Hydration. They're one of our sponsors. Andy is the co-founder and CEO. He is an expert in the science of hydration, salt and sweating, and we're going to be talking a lot about that today. He's also an accomplished age group triathlete. Are you still competing?
Not really, no.
Okay. All right. Well, it's never too late to get back into it, man. And he's from the UK.
Yeah.
Did I miss anything? Oh, you're the author of several studies and books on the topic of sweating and nutrition. So, yeah. Thank you so much for joining.
No, thank you for the invite. It was a bit came together well.
It worked out really well, but
yeah.
it was quite mad dash.
Yeah.
So, but thank you.
Cool. Yeah, thanks Rob. Thanks everyone for showing up on what was a wet and windy day. I come into San Francisco, I didn't expect things to be quite this high tech, I've got to say. The cables and everything, but all good. So, see if I can make this work. So, yep, I would say, as well as the things that Rob's told you about me, I can tell you that I'm a elite sweater for sure. No one quite sweats as well as me. Well, I've met a few people since I've retired actually that run me close, but very, very big sweat rate and world-class cramper as well. There's a great video which I haven't got here today to show you of me going to a full body cramp at the finish of an Ironman and getting put on a gurney and taken off to one side. So I've got a bit of personal experience of what I'm going to talk to you about as well as some professional experience. Sorry?
At least you waited till the end.
Yes, yeah, it was just just as I crossed the line and it was over. First of all, I thought we'd talk about the physiology of sweating just fairly quickly because it's kind of interesting. I find it interesting anyway. And starting off with the question of why humans sweat so much, because people maybe don't always realise that if out of all the animals, all the mammals on Earth, humans actually sweat the most per unit surface area. So horses sweat quite a bit. They sweat more in total than we do. That's because they're a lot bigger. But if you take a small sample of the skin surface, they will sweat quite a bit less. Their sweat rate will be less than that of a human. And when you look at physiological traits that are built into our bodies, they're there for a reason. There's an evolutionary purpose behind them, and the evolutionary reason that we sweat is thought to be because our bodies evolved on the African savanna in a very hot and dry climate. And when you're in extreme heat, and especially in extreme dry heat, you've kind of got a couple of ways that you can tackle that situation from a survival point of view. You can, like these kind of animals do, have fur to protect you from the sun. You can move in short, fast bursts and then do a lot of resting in the shade. And these kind of creatures, they tend to stay relatively static a lot of the time, and they minimise body heat production. They lose heat by panting, so that's why if you've got a dog in the summer, it's sitting there with its mouth open, panting the whole time. That's not to do with getting oxygen in or carbon dioxide out so much as transferring heat to the external environment. But what humans do is completely different. We actually leak water onto our skin and evaporate it off in order to cool us down. And that's a really, really effective way of cooling down, because the challenge in a hot environment is if your core body temperature goes up too high, you die. It's that simple. Your core body temperature is regulated in a really, really tight range. So in a hot, dry environment, you can either tackle it with these adaptations, or humans evolved in a different way. And it's thought when an evolutionary trait sticks with a species, it's because it offers some kind of competitive advantage. So it's not obvious at first, like, what is the competitive advantage of leaking water out onto your skin and letting it evaporate? But when you think about the way we would hunt a creature like that, we can't outrun those things. They can run at like 60 odd miles an hour. We can run, even the fastest humans kind of limited around 20 miles an hour. So there's no way we're going to just run up and catch one of these things like a big cat would or something like that. But the way that we could hunt in extreme heat is you can run one of these animals into heat exhaustion, and that's what they used to do. It's called persistence hunting. And so groups of hunters would go out in the middle of the day, in the very hottest part of the day, track animals and jog after them and sweat and keep cool, and then the animals would sprint off and then overheat and then have to stop, and then you get close and then they go again. If you do that for 5 or 6 hours, you can run them into heat exhaustion. So, and it's still occasionally, it's been observed in the modern era, obviously less frequently because there's easier ways to get your dinner now, but that's the basis for why we've got great endurance in the heat, is because we sweat, we cool, and that keeps going. So there's not any other animals really that could do something like the Hawaii Ironman, for example, could keep going at that intensity in that hot and humid environment, because they would overheat. Is there any you've got dogs that you run with? Like that, yeah. What are they like in the summer?
About as bad as I am.
Yeah, awful basically, aren't they? Yeah, they're terrible. And then if you run dogs in the winter, they're really good because the thermal cutoff is removed. So basically, we evolved. The point that I'm laboriously making here is that we've evolved to sweat a lot. That's good because it allows us to exercise in the heat and offload heat to the environment, but it comes at a cost, because how often do these creatures need to drink? Like once every couple of days if they need to. We have to drink every few hours in a hot, dry environment, otherwise we die. So there's that trade-off. There's always a trade-off with these things, and that applies to athletes as much as it does to anyone else. If we exercise and sweat, clearly we need to drink to offset some of those sweat losses. So water is obviously in our sweat, and I'm sure most of you know that you've got more than just water in your sweat. You lose a lot of electrolytes. Electrolytes are just minerals that are dissolved in your bodily fluids, and they are electrically charged. The main ones, sodium, potassium, magnesium and calcium, they all have different functions. The predominant electrolyte that you find in your extracellular fluid, which is the fluid that's outside your body's cells, including the blood plasma, is sodium, and the predominant electrolyte that you find inside your body's cells, in the intracellular fluid, is potassium. And the reason that's important is when you look at the composition of sweat, which is what that little ring is on the side there, the vast majority of the electrolytes that you lose in your sweat is sodium, because sodium is drawn from your blood plasma. So that's the reservoir from which the sweat comes. It's the watery part of your blood. And that's a really important concept for athletes to understand, because we all kind of intuitively, or have been told, we know that dehydration is bad for us. But one of the principal reasons dehydration is bad for an athlete when you're exercising is because it reduces your blood volume. The plasma volume of your blood drops, which makes your blood thicker, makes it harder to pump around the body, means you've got less of it to go to the skin to cool you down, and less of it to go to your working muscles. So it's one of the things that can compromise your performance if you don't keep your blood volume up. So when we're looking at replacing electrolytes in sports supplements, it's usually sodium that is the most important electrolyte. In rare cases potassium can come into it, but mostly it's replacement of sodium when you're sweating a lot that's the big issue. So there was a big buzz a few years ago about coconut water being, the nature's own great sports drink. I read a thing about Coca-Cola and Body Armor. They bought Body Armor for $5 billion, and they're selling that as a sports drink on the basis that it's low sodium. So make up your own mind about how great that marketing is. Right, how do we work out what we lose in terms of sweat and sodium? Because this is important, because this is, as an athlete, figuring out how much you lose in your sweat, both in terms of volume and in terms of concentration, is the first step on understanding your physiology and understanding your response to the type of exercise that you're doing. So there's a fairly simple equation, which is you want to know your sweat concentration, so how much electrolyte is in your sweat, what your sweat rate is, so that's the amount of litres per hour or ounces per hour that you're going to sweat out, obviously how many hours, the duration of the activity, and that will give you a number for your individual sweat loss. So you'll be losing X amount of litres of fluid and Y amount of milligrams of sodium. Just to give you some guardrails as to what those numbers look like in reality, lowish rate of sweating for an athlete that's working pretty hard, like going at an endurance triathlon race intensity, might be as low as about 500 millilitres or 16 ounces an hour in a temperate environment, and a high rate is probably as much as 2 litres per hour, although we do see outliers. That would be the majority of people falling within that bracket. We do see people who are outside of those brackets, and sometimes quite considerably so. They're in the minority, but they exist. I'm one of them. With the sweat rate, I can easily sweat out 2.5 litres an hour, but I've met athletes who can sweat 4.5 litres an hour.
I was just a question about the sweat test though. How do you do that and like get it precise when you're drinking water at the same time?
So the easiest way is to try to, if you're doing a controlled session, which isn't too long, weigh yourself holding the bottle, or weigh the bottle separately before and after, so that you can subtract the amount.
But even
of water
then, your
you
clothes are sweaty. I mean, that's what I've always.
But that's
thought.
what you do. You take you not in the gym, but you take all your clothes off. You do this at home, and you towel down. Genuinely, there's a blog on our website which gives you literally step-by-step instructions on how to do it. Because you're right, all of those things. If you're wearing a bike chamois, that'll get full of sweat. It will contaminate the results. So you just need to be able to weigh yourself. You know, when we do it in the lab, when I've done lab studies of it, we get these little tents. You know, like the little when you go camping, you get a little toilet tent which you unzip and people go in. So we have one of those in the lab with a set of scales inside. So people go in there, they get completely naked, they towel down, they weigh before, and then they weigh like that again after, and then you get really accurate numbers. And we weigh their bottles, and it's not complicated, it's just fiddly. You just have to get the setup right. But if you've got a home trainer or a treadmill or something like that, you can do quite a bit of repeat sweat testing once you've got it dialed with a set of scales, and you can learn quite a lot about what your numbers look like. And on the link that we can send round to the group, you can download a spreadsheet that we've created. There's a Google sheet there which you just plug the numbers into. We put all the formulas in there to work everything out. So you just put your starting weight, your end weight, the weight of your bottles, and it will spit everything out for you. But it's a really good question, because if you do it badly, you get bad data.
You get like zero sweat because you're covered in sweat.
Yeah,
that's not right.
It doesn't work. Yeah, exactly. So we've got big differences in total sweat rates, and we've got huge differences in sweat sodium losses as well. So some people lose as little as 200 milligrams in a litre of sweat, which is really, really dilute, and other people can lose over 2,000 milligrams to over 2 grams of sodium in a single litre of sweat. So they're the people that you see after an event and they're covered in salt flakes all over their skin and their black kit is all white. That was me. I lose about 1,800 milligrams a litre of sweat. The average is about 950, and it's relatively genetically set, so it doesn't tend to move around too much. What Jack and I have been doing the last couple of weeks is travelling around the baseball teams, the MLB teams. We do a lot of sweat testing with them, and they pretty much only test the new players that come in, because a lot of the teams used to test every player every year, and what they learned was when you retest these guys year after year, you get the same result. So they just test the new people that come in, and then they have a number that they can work off.
Does your sweat rate change with time, or that's the
sweat rate can change a lot more. That's a lot more dynamic. Yeah, there are genetic variables involved with it, so some people just do sweat more than others, but your individual sweat rate can go up or go down, and it will do in different climates, different states of heat acclimation, and that sort of thing.
Does it have an impact if you have like a high sodium diet, like somebody who just eats a shit ton of salt?
Good question. So that we get asked that one a lot. Yeah. Asking for a friend. Yeah. So the short answer is no, not really. We've got, again, there's a blog that dissects that question, because it's never as simple as just like categoric no, but the mechanism that controls sodium balance in the body is your kidneys and how much sodium you retain or pee out in the inside the kidney, so you don't rely on sweating as a mechanism to homeostatically control the level of sodium in your body, because it would be unreliable, because if you don't do anything you don't really sweat, and so you couldn't dump an excess. So the way that it works is you remember I said that your sweat comes from your blood plasma. So your blood plasma is very salty. That's at 3,600 milligrams a litre. And that's that everyone, if we took a measurement from everyone here, you would get a really narrow band. That doesn't vary, because that is the level that's compatible with you being healthy. It's controlled like your core body temperature between close parameters. your blood plasma then goes into the capillary bed. Obviously it's circulating in the capillary bed. When your brain switches on your sweat glands, it pulls plasma from the capillary beds into the sweat glands, and then that plasma is what goes out onto the surface of the skin and evaporates. The reason it's not as salty as 3600 is your sweat gland has little channels that reclaim those electrolytes, and some people simply have better reclamation than others. That's when they do skin biopsies, that's what they see. So people with cystic fibrosis are really at the extreme end. They can lose over 3000 milligrams of sodium per litre of sweat because their sweat glands do not function properly at all. So people with CF have a really, really salty sweat. But the rest of us are usually somewhere between 200 and 2000, which is still quite a big range, because it's a very different approach you're going to need to take to replacing electrolytes if you're at 200 than if you're at 2000. So how much do you need to replace fluid and sodium wise? Well, that is the million, or probably these days, according to Coca-Cola, the $1 billion question, because that's what everyone wants to know. That's what every athlete wants to know, is how much do I need to drink, how much electrolyte do I need to replace? And like every good sort of simple sounding question, it's got a very complicated answer that starts with it depends. There's no one size fits all answer to this, because we've got to take into account differences in your individual physiology and differences in the event and the environment that you're competing in or training in or whatever. So, and then layered on top of that, there's all sorts of other small minutiae that we have to take into account. But we'll jump in and look at some actual examples. So just to highlight these, there's a lot of text on there, I apologise, but athlete 1 is essentially someone with a low sweat sodium concentration and a low to moderate sweat rate. And this is real data from real people who've given us permission to use it, people that we've tested. And then athlete 2 is a high sweat sodium concentration athlete with a moderate to high sweat rate. So 30 millimoles of sodium per litre of sweat is 614 milligrams, that's pretty low. Sweat rate of about 750 millilitres an hour and a duration of 9 hours. So this could be an ultra marathon or a fast Ironman for an age grouper. This person would lose an estimated net hourly sodium loss of 460 milligrams. Total estimated sodium loss over that 9 hours of about 4,000 milligrams, and a total estimated fluid loss of 6.75 litres, which, they sound like reasonable amounts, but from my experience, I can tell you they're not all that high. This is not a person who's going to have a hard time replacing a good proportion of those fluid losses during the race. So they're going to probably be able to just drink when they feel like drinking. They probably take some electrolytes, and they're probably going to get round just fine, all other things being equal. This is not someone who's going to have a huge issue with it. This person on the other side, 60 millimole, which is 1200 milligrams, which remember is not super high in our data set, but it's pretty high. Bigger sweat rate, 1.5 litres an hour, going for 9 hours as well. They're going to be losing 1.8 grams of sodium an hour, 16 grams of sodium overall, and 13 litres of fluid. So straight away you can see that these two people are doing the same event, but the physiological consequences of it are completely different. So this is a good reason not to copy someone else's hydration plan for an event, because unless you could be confident that your physiology is very similar to theirs, there can be a very, very big difference. And where this person is probably going to meet their needs with a very sort of laissez-faire approach to their hydration, this person is going to require a much more detailed look at what they're doing and a bit of strategy around carrying enough stuff and timing and quantities that they're going to drink in order to meet a reasonable proportion of those needs.
How do you extrapolate? How do you extrapolate that person loses 1.5 liters an hour for 9 hours? Because I feel sometimes, even on the trainer, if I go for 4 or 5 hours, like I work hard the first 2 hours, but then I get so tired that I don't really sweat anymore.
Yeah.
Like I feel it shouldn't necessarily be a consistent sweat rate.
Yes, that's very true. So what we tend to do when we're looking at case studies of people doing very long events is the sampling period for when you do a sweat test will be far, far longer. So you might do a 3 hour or a 4 hour assessment at a power output or a running pace. Ideally for a triathlete, you would get them in the lab and you would set up a bike and a treadmill and you would weigh them at the start and you would get them to bike for say 2 hours and run for 1 hour, and then if that's done at a similar, if the environment's similar to the race, and if the pace and power is similar, you can be reasonably assured that then you can extrapolate that number up. The bigger it's like anything, when you take a small sliver of data, you've got to be careful at how you multiply that up. So that's another really good point. You can't expect to take 30 minutes of sweat data and then multiply that up to 9 hours, because you're right. And in terms of what you were saying about intensity, your intensity is dropping off over a number of hours. That's true if your fitness level isn't a match for the sort of event that you're doing. But when we work with a lot of the elite athletes, you look at the pace they're running at in the marathon, say the guys running 2:40 for a marathon at the end of an Ironman and stuff, they are sweating at an insane level, because they're running at 1 o'clock in the afternoon in the hottest part of the day at under 6 minutes a mile. So it's kind of, they've also got the fitness then to keep that level up, which makes the difference. I think where that comes into play way more is we work with ultra marathon runners running 100 miles and stuff, and actually there's this kind of weird inverted U of hydration demands, where really short events have very low demands for hydration because you're not going for long enough. Then they build as you go longer and longer and longer, and the intensity builds. And when you get very fit people who can smash an Ironman in 7 hours and 40 minutes, and they have incredible sweat rates for an incredibly long period of time. But as we go off the other side and we go up to a 24-hour ultra running event, nobody can hold the intensity, so the sweat rates naturally drop, and then it becomes actually counterintuitively less of an issue. So there's kind of this, and I would say sort of, depending on fitness level, somewhere between that 6 and maybe 10 hour window is actually a really hard, that's where you're peaking with the intensity and the sweat rate, but you're not necessarily able to meet your hydration demands as easily. It becomes more of a limiter.
I had a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Of like the people you've seen and like the data you've looked at, for those two examples, like how far apart are those, or like what percentile would you say those are in, respectively?
So they're both at the edge of what I would consider, like we'd look at them and both go, this is pretty normal, but you're on the low side of normal. This is within what we'd say is normal and the high side. So I couldn't sort of quote you on a percentile, but there would be I'd be surprised if I saw people going routinely way above that. And I'm going to give you an example of someone in a minute who's way on the higher side, so you can see the real extreme there. But I don't know, 85% of the people that we ever test are going to fall within the boundaries of what I've just showed you there, and there'll be a few outliers.
Okay.
Something like that. Probably more outliers as well on the higher side than the lower side. Just because I guess that might be a skewed perception, because the kind of people that come and see us are the kind of people who are having problems rather than the people who aren't having problems. So maybe I don't see
I'm
those.
1480 per liter.
Yeah,
I tested
it's
it.
high. Yeah.
Yeah.
So often I put this slide up because often it's been presented, this kind of idea of drinking to thirst, drinking to a plan, has been presented as two polar opposites. Like, you either are someone who's happy to drink to thirst, you're just going to not have a plan, you're just going to have a bottle there, you're going to drink it when you feel like doing, and everything's going to be fine. There are plenty of, even quite intelligent physiologists and other people that I've spoken to who are convinced that that's fine for everyone. That's the advice. If you've read any of Tim Noakes' work, it's like he's one of the most eminent researchers in physiology, but his approach is like, well, all of this, drink to thirst, you don't need to worry about planning your hydration. You will read from other people, like often, and I'm in that camp, but people with something to sell you are going to sell you the idea of a plan. The plan, you need a strategic approach, and you need to have these products, you need to have them in these quantities, and it's all got to be regimented. And I think this continuum is an important concept, because very rarely is anyone at one end of this continuum or the other. There are grey areas in between, which most of us operate in, which is where you're going to need a bit of a plan for what you're doing hydration wise, but you're going to listen to your body a little bit as the race unfolds and it develops. So you are going to listen to your thirst instincts as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we might do that and some examples. This guy is an interesting character. His name's Alan Hovda, and he got in touch with me a few years ago because he read a book by Tim Noakes called Waterlogged, which some of you may have heard of, which was a book that came out in 2012 that basically wanted to debunk the idea that you needed sports drinks if you're an athlete. It was saying you just drink water when you're thirsty and you're all good. And a lot of people read it, and it's very convincing. It's a really well written book. It's got wadges of references in there, and it's a proper scientific book. But he read it and he followed that advice when in the Norseman triathlon, which some of you might be familiar with, which is a really extreme Ironman triathlon in Norway. The weather can be very variable, but quite often it's very cold. And Alan won the Norseman in 2015 with a course record. It was under 10 Celsius, so close to freezing point really. And he wrote a blog online saying how he'd like used this approach, drink to thirst, and how it was the way forward. And I put a comment on his blog and just sort of said, I don't think, this is like not great information that you're putting out there, kind of thing. And nothing happened from it. And then Alan went and did Kona, and he went and did Ironman Texas, which doesn't sound there, and he ended up in the medical tent. And he then, but good on him, he emailed me and said, I read what you said and I'd like to come and have a sweat test and understand this a bit more. And we worked together a little bit and we put together some plans for some of his longer, hotter races. And now Alan has a sweat testing machine from us and sweat tests people in Norway, because he figured out that whilst what he said was entirely true for those conditions, it's not universally true. You sometimes need a more strategic approach. So that was an interesting study case. This is another interesting one. So this is Tim Reed, who was Ironman 70.3 world champion, and I've worked a bit with Tim. And Tim is someone he's one of these outliers with an off the charts high sweat rate. So Tim's won loads of races, but never usually in extreme heat. He can do okay, and he can do 70.3 in the heat, but going for 8 hours or whatever, he just ends up as a horrible, cramping, ruined mess on the run because he can't keep up with his fluid needs, because he's, I think, over 3 litres an hour of sweat rate for a guy who's not very big at all. He's like shorter than me and a lot skinnier than me. So, and you can see what he says about it. He has quite a nuanced approach to it, saying, look, drinking to thirst is good when you're going at low intensity, but when you're really pushing hard, when you've got a high sweat rate in the heat, it's not good enough. And he even highlights the fact that listening to your body and just drinking when you're thirsty can be quite difficult to do when you're in a stressful race situation, because especially if you're new to racing, you've got a lot of other biofeedback and a lot of stress and anxiety going on. You could get quite deep into a race before you even realise that you're getting quite thirsty and quite dehydrated. So just a couple of counterpoints to that drink to thirst idea. This guy, you were asking about the kind of outliers potentially, or where that group was. This guy is very much this guy I think is right on the outer limit of what's possible from what I've seen. And Luke contacted us. Luke is an Aussie age group triathlete. Again, he's not a huge guy. He's not as tall as me. He loses 2,100 milligrams of sodium per litre of sweat, so that's right on the high end of what we ever see, and he can easily sweat 3 litres an hour in kind of Kona-like conditions, in hot 30 degrees Celsius conditions. And when he sent me some data initially, because he sent me a bunch of data because his wife, I think, had nagged him because he'd been into so many hospitals and medical tents at the end of races, and he hadn't finished a lot of races, and she had basically given him an ultimatum of like, if you can't sort this out, this is bad for your health, we're stopping with the racing or whatever. And he's like, well, I've qualified for Kona, so probably going to do it. He sent me a load of numbers, so he did his home sweat tests, and he'd had a lab do a sweat sodium reading, and it was 2,000 whatever, and he'd done his sweat tests at home, and the numbers were off the charts. So I was like, this guy's a joker, he doesn't know what he's doing. So got him to do one of our sweat tests, the number came out the same. Got him to do some sweat rate testing under supervision, came out the same, and we realised that and all of his symptoms that he was suffering were, sort of consistent with what you'd expect for someone who's suffering massive fluid and electrolyte losses. So we figured out, we did it on a spreadsheet, and we figured out that roughly we thought he would need to drink about 1.5 litres per hour on the bike in the Ironman, and that he'd have to have about 2,000 milligrams of sodium in every litre. So that's 3,000 milligrams of sodium an hour in 1.5 litres of fluid. And on them we decided that it was easier for him to load up a bit more on the bike, because you can carry more. On the run it's going to be hard to drink that much. So I basically wrote this out, and then I was talking to him on Zoom, and I sort of said, well, I can't even really recommend that you do this, because I have no idea whether this is a good idea or not, but it kind of feels like the only way forward. So essentially sign this disclaimer, this information is not from me, but you can go try it. And so, you know, we had this kind of this difference of like Alan in the Norseman, like doing this, like I'm just going to drink to thirst, and then Luke was firmly at this end with his drink to a plan. And what he did, he drank 6.3 litres on the bike. He, with about of electrolyte solution washed down with only 600 millilitres of plain water. He had 2.4 litres of electrolyte drinks on the run, as well as 3 litres of plain water. 10 electrolyte capsules, so that was 2,500 milligrams of sodium in those. So his total intakes are down here, and his comment at the end was so good. He said it was completely unbelievable. I didn't experience any cramping. I didn't feel my hydration caused me any problems. This is the first time he'd actually like raced. So he's potentially got 4th in his age group. All was good, and that was in Ironman. It was either Ironman Cairns or Ironman Western Australia. So it wasn't a cold race. This was a pretty hot race, and that for me was a really, like, I was nervous with him going into that race with that kind of strategy, because I didn't think someone could drink 1.5 litres an hour with 2,000 milligrams of sodium per litre, because I've just not seen that before. And then someone goes and kind of pushes the outer limit. And the reason I highlight this is not to say that, not to communicate in any way that I think drinking more and taking loads more sodium is better. It's just that this represents kind of the far end of the continuum of what you might need to do if your losses are really, really high. And most of us can take comfort from the fact that we're somewhere south of that. You know, with Alan's example being at the other end, like just drinking when he felt thirsty in cold conditions and not sweating a lot, right through to Luke at this end. Now, to be clear on this, like this case study is published on our website. If you want to read it, you just go into the athletes pages and look at the case studies. We've got 2 other case studies from Luke, which interestingly didn't go so well. So when you write right on the limit like this, he was, because Franklin was telling me you had a problem in Kona last year, Luke was there, he had a problem in Kona, he got diluted potassium levels because he was drinking so much on the bike and not taking any potassium with it. So his sodium levels he kept up because he was focused on that number. He didn't supplement any potassium at all and diluted that down. And he got horrible symptoms like swelling, tingling hands, tingling feet and face, like he was all over the place, got pulled off the course on the run. Like a few hours later when they pumped some potassium into him, he was fine. But luckily there were some medics there that knew what they were doing and sorted him out. So when you're on that edge, it's not like you can just nail it every time, but it's just a really illustrative example of that extreme end.
Can you make up for like lost or missed nutrition? Like you start the bike, you don't really feel like drinking, you don't drink for 2 hours, and then it's like, oh shoot, I should probably.
Not if you're built like that. Not in hot conditions normally. That's why we, you know, and I think in an Ironman situation, the bike is the best time to be hydrating. And with Alan, he sort of pushed this concept on me of saying, well, let's try and figure out what I need to drink to get off the bike with 0% dehydration, because he's going to accept a level of dehydration through the run, but I would say that it's part of the discipline of getting it right. If conditions are hot, or if you're someone who loses a lot of sweat, starting to drink early in the bike and having a plan. And actually, arguably, having a plan for the earlier part of the race is more important than later, because later on you need to listen to your body a lot to figure out what state you're in, because 6 hours in no one can predict exactly how you're going to feel. But that first part, you should be working to some kind of plan, in my opinion, to, you know, make sure you're getting off on the right foot. It's too easy. I've done enough of those sort of long races where you definitely feel great in the first 2 hours, you don't feel like you need to eat, you don't feel like you need to drink, and then all of a sudden it hits you. So you've got to try not to get behind.
So we're talking about like high heat races. I feel like when I usually race in high heat or like run in high heat, I have a plan, at least somewhat of a plan, but I get really nauseous in the heat, and I think that's common with some other folks I've spoken to. Like, how do you stick to the plan, or like how do you prevent that nausea so that you can actually like continue taking these nutrients throughout the race?
It's tricky. In the heat, I think there's different things that can make you nauseous. One of them is the heat itself. Excuse me. If you if your core body temperature goes up too high, that can start to make you feel nauseous, and the only way to combat that really is to slow down. And so the other thing that can make you nauseous is too much carbohydrate, because and I think there is a subtle difference in how those things feel. Like, you feel nauseous like you do when you're sick, when your core body temperature is going up too high, and you might feel quite sort of foggy headed and that sort of thing as well. When you've just taken in too much sugar, or you have taken in too much carbohydrate for the fluid that you've taken on to dilute it and absorb it, it's more like that kind of sick feeling you got as a kid when you went to a birthday party and ate too much cake and sweets. You know, it's that exact same thing. You just overloaded the gut with too much sugar. And so it's a case of, you know, we talk to athletes when we talk about the overall fueling and hydration plan for a race as being contingent on three things. It's how much carbohydrate you're taking per hour, how much fluid you're taking per hour, and how much sodium you're taking per hour. If one or two or all three of those things are a little bit out of whack, nausea is usually the end result. So then it's a case of like working through the list, like, have I tried these levels of intake before? Am I going too fast? There's all of these confounding factors, but boiling it down to like speed, core body temperature, fluid, salt and carbs, and then you just got to tweak those levers a little bit and see if you can pull it back in. There's usually not a magic bullet, but if you do those things in an organised way, you can often sort of home in on it.
How do you physically transport electrolytes with you on a long bike? Like, you just have one bottle that's super concentrated and you keep track of how much you've been drinking?
Yep. There's two different ways, really.
If you don't have like your special table.
Yeah, there's probably two ways of doing it. That is one of them. So you make a super concentrated bottle, so you know exactly how much fluid, how much sodium is in there. We work with a number of pro athletes who do that, and they'll just work their way through that along with titrating it with water as they go. Or you can carry electrolyte capsules, so kind of pills that you start off with whatever, probably 2 or 3 bottles on your bike for a long race, which has got whatever your preferred solution is, and then you just flip to picking up water from the aid stations and washing down. I used to take just 250 milligram sodium capsules. I would actually use carpet tape, you know, like the double-sided kind of sticky tape, and stick it under the aero bar pads and under the bar, and then just peel those off and have those and just drink water with it. Keep it really simple. All you got to do is hit your numbers. You know, people get really caught up on certain products or certain this or that. You just need to get the numbers in. You know, and I suppose the other thing is if you're doing ultra runs and that kind of stuff, people sometimes stop at aid stations because it's not like on the bike in an Ironman where you can't really stop. So they'll take packets of drink mix and things like that and mix things up as they go. But
yeah, in an ideal world, is there a way to do the whole hydration thing without, you know, needing to pee at some point along the course?
In an Ironman, I'd say, like, a lot of the pro athletes we work with probably don't pee or pee once, maybe twice in the race, because their sweat rates are super, super high and they're going for a shorter period of time. I would say it's not great if you don't pee at least once during an Ironman. You're probably not drinking enough. But if you're peeing more than 3 or 4 times, you perhaps something is out of balance, either too much sodium, too little sodium, or too much water. So everyone's a bit different with that, but it's not an aim to like not have to pee. I would say that's a sign that you're hydrating well enough that you pee once or twice on the bike.
What about shorter races like Ollie or half Iron?
Generally, so I can only speak on personal experience with that. I would probably not have generally peed during a half Ironman if I got my hydration and fluid right. One of the things I'm going to talk about sodium preloading before events, because sometimes you end up peeing in a race because you've overhydrated beforehand, and sort of avoiding that. You want to be optimally hydrated when you start, but not overhydrated, and that can help. Temperature affects it as well, though, because often we all know if you jump in a cold lake or in the sea, and that makes you pee anyway. So. You know, and it's not as bad, I suppose, peeing in your wetsuit as peeing on your bike. So, sweat testing. We've talked about doing sweat rate testing, and there's a great blog on our website. You can we'll send that around. You download a spreadsheet, you weigh yourself before and after some activities, making them as representative of your race situation as you can in terms of duration, intensity and environment, and then you can start to understand what your sweat rate is like. Sweat sodium concentration, there's different ways of doing it. I'm highlighting the way that we do it, which is with an at-rest sweat test. So we put some electrodes on your arm, we stimulate the sweat glands, and we take a sweat sample, and that basically gives you a number on that sweat sodium scale, which, you know, yours was 1400, mine's 1800. We'll probably, if we tested everyone in here, we'd have some 600s as well. You know, we just see a range. And Brad's here from Purple Patch, who offer the testing in the city here, which is like, you could throw a stone at your place, can you? Whichever way.
Direction that is.
Yeah, so if anyone's interested, if you're in the city and you want to talk to Brad about getting sweat tested there, if you're up in Mill Valley and you know Tim at Endurance, he offers sweat testing up there, and down in Santa Cruz is a guy called Dave Liotta, whose business is called BFit, and he offers sweat testing as well. So there's plenty of options around here. You are probably the best place in the world when it comes to getting a sweat test. So, you can go and get 3 if you want to check all of these guys out. Hopefully the number would be the same every time. Yeah, and it's just one of those things. I think, you know, we get asked all the time, is sweat testing, do I need to have a sweat test? And again, it's like the answer, it depends. I've heard a lot of people on podcasts recently. There's a few nutritionists doing the rounds. There's a couple of them that are promoting sweat testing, a couple of them that are bashing sweat testing. I think that sweat testing for me as an athlete was insanely useful. For Luke Henderson, it was insanely useful. For other people, it is not really useful because their events aren't long enough, they don't sweat enough, they compete in cold conditions. For those people, not useful. So you just got to make up your own mind if you're someone who might benefit from this, but if you are, then go for it.
Are there any arguments against sweat testing other than it's just not useful for certain races?
Not really. I mean, it's a one-off test. It's not particularly expensive, it's not arduous, there's no risk involved with it. So I don't see a huge amount of downside. It's like it's quite common at the moment to hear nutritionists talking about, there's a big debate about whether athletes need to take sodium or not, and there's a whole load of it. And one of the things that gets lost in that debate is that, you know, certainly there's probably, if we did a continuum of that, there's athletes that need, in my opinion, loads of it, and there's athletes that need none of it, and then somewhere in between, most of us need some of it or would benefit from some of it. But there's not a great deal of evidence to suggest that there's no real evidence to suggest that taking quite a bit of sodium when you're racing is in any way harmful. So there's potential upside. Because remember I talked right at the start about dehydration and blood volume. Well, if you just drink water, you can't expand your blood volume as much as you can if you drink salt plus water, because your body wants to maintain that sodium balance in the blood. So if you put sodium in with the fluids, that pulls into the bloodstream and holds it there and expands the blood volume. If you just put water in, you run the risk of diluting it down, and eventually that can lead to a condition called hyponatremia, which is where you get low blood sodium levels and end up in the ER.
If you're lucky.
If you're lucky, yeah, definitely, yeah. I was running with a guy actually up in wherever we were yesterday, Mill Valley yesterday, who nearly died at an ultra marathon because he got sodium depleted and drank loads of water, and then at the finish line was feeling all nauseous and horrible, passed out. They didn't do any medical tests on him and misdiagnosed that he was dehydrated and put 2 bags of IV in him, which made the problem worse. Luckily his brother or cousin was an emergency physician and got hold of the problem and managed to realise what they needed to do was pump him full of salt, and they did, and they managed to save him, but he was like right on the knife edge. So over drinking, you know, can be a huge problem with athletes. I mentioned, I'm only going to talk about this briefly, but cramping, you know, you saw Luke Henderson's comment about sorting his hydration out, sorting his cramps out. For me, when I sorted out sodium supplementation in my races, all my cramping problems were basically, or 99% of them were put to bed. So there's lots of anecdotal evidence out there that some people can sort their cramping issues out in endurance events by sorting their hydration or electrolyte and fluid balance. Now, no one really understands what the mechanisms behind cramping are exactly, so it's hard to be definitive, and certainly not all muscle cramps are related to electrolyte loss or electrolyte imbalance. But there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they might well be. And this diagram, which is a bit too complicated to dive into in a lot of detail now, is what's called it's a new multifactorial model of cramping that's been put together by a guy called Dr. Kevin Miller, who is at the University of Texas, and he studied cramping and exertional heat stress his whole career. And his view on it, which is a very balanced take, is that there is evidence for every single one of these things around here. There is some level of evidence that they could contribute to cramping. And often cramping is not something that happens due to one factor. There's often a recipe involved, and your personal recipe may be different to mine or whatever, and the contribution for different factors for different people can be slightly different. So, but electrolyte loss, sodium replacement are factors that often crop up and seem relevant to endurance athletes. And again, like with the sweat testing, if you're someone who does get cramps, there's very little downside to trying some additional sodium supplementation in your events, and there's a potential massive upside. So it's kind of one of those when, rather than arguing about whether sodium may or may not influence it, I would try taking it, and try taking it at the recommended dose, which is really important. A lot of people come to me and say, oh, I've tried taking sodium and it didn't work, and then you figure out that they've been taking 200 milligrams a litre or something like that, like it's some kind of magic dust that you just need a little bit of. And what you actually need to do is hit it pretty hard, and then you'll soon know whether it helps you or not.
Can you go too far? Could you have too much sodium?
Yeah, the good thing about sodium though is if you put too much of it in a drink, it will taste so disgusting you won't be able to drink it. So people say like, oh, but what if it was like seawater? Well, the strongest drink that we make as a company is pH 1500, which is 1500 milligrams of sodium per litre. And some people will mix it up a little bit stronger than that, maybe to 2000 milligrams a litre, and then it really is starting to taste pretty salty. Like seawater's 15,000 milligrams per litre. So if you go like too far beyond 2000, like some people use a sodium preload drink which has about 3000 or 3500 milligrams per litre, but even that is like pretty tough to get down, and you certainly wouldn't want to drink that when you're exercising. So you can. The danger really with taking too much usually comes when you're just popping pills, because that's easy to OD then. And the worst that's probably going to happen there is that you'd have to take a lot to make yourself really, really ill. But you're going to push your blood sodium levels up, you're going to get hypernatremia, you'll feel really thirsty, you'll crave loads of plain water, hopefully you'll start peeing quite a lot. But that's where just understanding what a relevant dose is really important. The biggest mistake we see there is that people use a brand of electrolyte capsules which say has 100 milligrams in, and then they end up with a different brand which has 300 milligrams in, and before you know it they're just taking 10 of those because they used to take 10 of those, and you've got 3 times the amount of salt going in. So it's just about knowing your numbers really. But if you're interested in cramping, there's a really good blog. It's the most read blog on our website. It's all about cramping. You go into the Knowledge Hub. It's got some stuff to read and some references in there. And I would say Google Dr. Kevin Miller, and he's been on a few podcasts recently. He does a really good talk about cramping and comes across quite balanced. He's actually a little bit more skeptical about the sodium replacement than I actually am, but then he's coming from a different background, so it's a good listen though. So give it a go if you're interested in that one. I'll give you one actionable takeaway thing from this, just to think about, because I think it's good to not just come here and absorb a load of stuff and not go away and try anything at all. And that's something called preloading. We get a lot of success when we recommend this to athletes this is something you would do before your hardest or longest training sessions, or your hottest training sessions or races. You wouldn't do it in a race before you've tested it in training. And preloading is basically something you do to get yourself to the start of that session properly, optimally hydrated, which isn't just drinking tons and tons of water. Because when you just drink loads of water, you absorb it to a certain extent and then you pee out what you don't need, and you flush more electrolytes out with it. And there's quite a good study that they did on ultramarathon runners at the Spartathon in Greece, which is a 150-mile race. It's very hot, and they took blood samples at the start line to have a look at blood electrolyte levels. everyone should be normal because you're just at the start line. 11% of the field were already hyponatremic or showing signs of hyponatremia because they'd drunk so much water in the days leading up to the race because they were worried about getting dehydrated. So don't overdrink water, just drink normally in the build-up, and then preloading is using a strong electrolyte drink. Kind of entry level for strong is 1500 milligrams a litre. You might be able to mix it up a little bit stronger than that. Our protocol is pretty simple. It's about 16 ounces with 750 milligrams in the night before your event if you're going off early in the morning, and it's about the same that you finish about 45 minutes before. So you do it right, and that displaces some water you would have otherwise drank at that time, so you're not adding it on top. Have those two. The extra sodium goes into your bloodstream. You're asking about how you don't pee. Well, hopefully this reduces the need to pee because the water goes into the bloodstream and stays there, most of it does, rather than flushing straight through you. And then you're on the start line way better hydrated. And although there's no such thing as a magic bullet, we do find that this is a really good protocol, both for people who lose a lot of salt in their sweat or a lot of sweat and suffer in the heat, and also it helps people with cramps quite often. So that's one thing to try. I've just said all of that really. And thanks for listening. You guys have a discount code with us if you want to try any of the products. It's just there. I'm sure Rob has that.
It's on the website as well.
Yeah,
yeah.
and share that around.
Yeah.
I'll remember to get some blogs to you to share off the back of this.
Awesome.
And then the other last thing to say is, which I haven't put a slide up about, is on our website, if you go to the top bar, there's something called the free fuel and hydration planner. You can bash your details in there, the kind of race that you're doing, a little bit about yourself, whether you think you're a heavy sweater or not. If you know your sweat test number, you can put your 1400 milligrams in, and it will give you a ballpark hydration and fueling plan for your event, and that's probably a good place to go. And Jack's got some little cards there with a QR code if you want to scan one of those and go on there. Yeah. But if anyone's got any questions, we've had a few good ones.
Do
But
you guys have any plans to do bigger packaging for like the 500s instead of individual samples?
The powder drink mix.
Yeah.
So we have got a new product which is not the same strength as that. We do some in the bulk bags now. We haven't managed to transition to doing those single sachets in bulk bags yet because of manufacturing constraints. It's a long and boring story about where we produce the powders, but in the future we will, yeah. I don't know how quickly, but it's on the list for sure. A lot of our new products are coming in bulk bags now. And we've managed to find some recyclable materials for that at last, which is good. So we've got like a single skin plastic rather than a laminate. Because the problem with powdered products is if you put them in anything that's got even the slightest water permeability, then they degrade really quickly. So it's tough, yeah.
Yeah, there's a couple sports nutritionists out there who really advocate for like salting your water in day-to-day life, especially for athletes who don't eat a whole lot of processed food. Is there any merit to that or any benefit to doing that?
I think the biggest benefit potentially to that is that if it tastes good, then your body probably needs it, and then that's a good sign because your body's very sensitive to the level of salt. So if a salty drink, if you put salt in water, it does taste very salty. If that tastes good, like it does when we finished Jack and I went on this horrific run yesterday with two guys that are training for a marathon that we're not training for. And afterwards, like I had one of our salty tablet things and it tasted like amazing because my body's like, yeah, you need this. But after a while, you kind of go back to water because water's what you need most of the time. And I think listening to your body on that is a really good thing. It's the same with salt in your food.
I have one more question.
Go for it.
There's nutrition products out there that are really concentrated for calories in your bottle. Is there a benefit to keeping your hydration and your food, your calories separate, or is it fine to combine them? Does that impact your hydration or your performance at all? What are your thoughts?
I think the thing to start with saying is if whatever you do works, it's fine. And we see people use really concentrated drinks to good effect some of the time. As a general rule, I'd say concentrated drinks work well in cold conditions and they work well with shorter races because you don't have as much deviation from what you need. It can all go in one bottle. So the professional cycling teams we work with will over concentrate our drink mix in the cold, and they'll dilute it down for in the heat, because basically you'll drink a lower volume. So you still want the same amount of calories, but you drink a lower volume in the cold and you drink a higher volume in the heat. So they just have a rule of thumb that they mix it to. In general, I'd say the longer and hotter your race gets, and or the bigger your sweat rate, the more success you'll have decoupling your hydration from your calories. So a lot of the time in a long hot race, we'll see people with water or water and electrolytes in their bottles, and then all of their calories coming from gels, because then you can adjust them as you need to. So it's a bit of a judgment call.
Andy, we had a question on our Slack channel.
Yeah.
I sent it to you. And I guess maybe, well, the question is, I eat goo every 30 minutes and sip water Gatorade at every aid station. My question to you would be, just to kind of flip that, because obviously sweat testing would probably help this person, but...
And this is a question about cramping, wasn't
yes,
it? Yes,
quads cramping and calves cramping. If that works for someone, could you back into how much sodium they're losing? Like if that's the plan, right? The plan is to eat goos every 30 minutes and make sure you have the Gatorade every rest stop. What kind of sodium sweat rate would they have for someone to not have any cramping issues? I'm kind of like...
Some people won't cramp whatever, because some people just don't seem to cramp. I think if you are cramping and that's happening, that what you're describing there, we don't know what a few sips are, but that isn't going to be a high amount of fluid and sodium that you're taking in. So the initial thing there would actually be to do a deeper dive into exactly what that person's consuming, run the numbers on it, but the chances are they're light on fluid and sodium. So we would usually immediately flip them onto doing some preloading before that event, see if that helps. Having a bottle of the, something like pH 1500 on the bike, along with the gels, so that they're making sure that they're starting the run with a decent amount of fluid and sodium having gone back in. And also alongside that, doing things like sweat rate testing and stuff, just to figure out if they're likely to be an outlier or not. So a little bit of individual investigation, but it doesn't sound like, for example, that's not someone who's throwing a load of electrolytes and fluids at the problem at the moment. They kind of think they are, but maybe because I think a lot of goos don't have much sodium in, or some of them have none.
Right.
And Gatorade only has about 400 or 500 milligrams in, so it's pretty light.
Any other questions, guys?
Yeah, I need to. Go for it.
Curious, how would you account for different climates that are a little bit drier? So, for example, in Canada, I had a strict nutrition hydration regimen, and it was fine. But then in Arizona, where I kept the same regimen, but it was very arid and dry.
Yeah.
I think I may have overdone it a bit.
Yeah.
And so, how do you account for those different types of climate where it is dry?
Yeah, it's a good question, because the difference between a set heat and two different humidity levels can be really, really vast. Like we saw that with last year, with there being two Ironman World Championships at St George, which is hot and dry, and then Kona, which is hot and humid. And I'd have to go back, and one of the things you could do actually is, if you look on the case studies on our website, we've got case studies from St George, and we've got case studies from exactly the same people in Kona as well. So we've got at least, I can think of at least 4 people that we case studied in both races. So that would be a really good starting point. But my guess is that you would see a trend towards like higher overall intakes in heat and humidity. Some of that might be because it's needed, and some of it might be because you're aware of it. Whereas I've just come from Arizona, where we were out running, and you just get back from a run and you haven't drunk anything and you're just dry, but you also are dried out because you've sweated and it's all just evaporated straight away. So I think the sensation, probably having more of a stricter plan in those kind of conditions is useful, and then understanding, and if in an ideal world, going out or at least trying to simulate those conditions in some way so you can figure out the discrepancy in your sweat losses. But my gut feel, without looking at the data, is that we saw across the board some of the highest fluid and sodium intakes anywhere in Kona last year, and even the ones in St George were like, they were higher than an average race, but they weren't quite as high. Yeah. Go for it.
Does a sweat test show you how much you sweat? It's just the composition of your sweat?
And there's a lot of you know, when we put it's called a macroduct collector that we put on, and the sweat goes into a piece of tubing and coils round and round and round, and the speed at which that collects is often subjectively quite indicative of what someone's sweat rate is like, but we can't put a number to it because trying to extrapolate from a small site on the skin to the whole body is a really tough task. There are people working on that with these wearable sweat sensors and those kind of things, and I've not seen any compelling data from anyone yet as to how well you can do that. I'd imagine there's a correlation between what you see on a small surface area to total body, but how individual that is, how easy that is to work out, I'm not sure. We've been testing a couple of sensors that are on the market now back at base for us, and have seen some real big inconsistencies compared with weighing, but even that we haven't got enough data to make a solid call on it yet. So really weighing yourself is still the gold standard for that at the moment.
Does your sodium loss rate vary by temperature at all, or is it pretty consistent?
It's pretty consistent, yeah. Remarkably consistent, really. So I did a training camp with some endurance athletes in California a few years ago, and we basically sweat tested them 3 times a day in between training sessions and put sweat collectors on them during training sessions, and after 3 days it was like the most boring job in the world because I knew what was going to happen every time. It was going to be the same result, and that's how it stayed for a week. So there's not tons of data out there on that, but I've seen enough with my own eyes to sort of think that, I mean, I couldn't tell you what happens in hour 10 of an Ironman for someone because I haven't done that, but I'd imagine it's like relatively consistent. But we'll see when these wearable sensors start working, because people will wear these things for an entire Ironman and we'll get some way more granular data.
On the sweat concentration test, like you mentioned that like you found that year on year a lot of athletes like stayed the same. Like, are there outliers to that? Because I wouldn't consider myself a very salty sweater, but I've had sweat tests in the past that were off the charts, like CF diagnosable high, which like genetic testing said it wasn't. But like I've had 3 sweat tests over the years, and like they've often been high, but since I became more athletic, I haven't seen that correlate to like you know, crusty sweat and stuff like that. Like I don't. So I think it's just like are there cases? Like
there are. I've never seen someone that we've repeat tested where they've gone from say being very low to very high or vice versa. We've seen people move around a bit more than we'd expect, but I mean in general, on average, it seems to be no more than about 10% variation from where your number is. There are a few that we've seen, but often because this testing is not always conducted by us, or it's not always conducted with the same technology. It could be a patch test from one lab, and it could be a test like we do with a macroduct. You've got to make sure you're comparing like with like. So I would say, just based on the fact that, you know, our data set is very relevant to athletes, because we've sweat tested really a huge proportion of sort of people who are really quite fit and probably in good shape when we've tested them. So we don't have a huge amount of data from people who were sedentary and then became really athletic or anything, which might drive some, I couldn't tell you whether that would drive a little bit more of a change. And we've seen a few that have moved, but just as a general rule, not too much. So that probably doesn't help you all that much, I don't know.
I just think I test it again and see
test it and
Awesome. Cool. Real quick, thank you so much. So let's give Andy a round of applause.